I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.
Hello horror hounds and welcome to my horror house. Tim Burton's Sleepy Hollow was released 20 years ago and I can still remember going to the cinema to watch it. I can still remember really liking it. Tim Burton clearly knew and loved his horror history, liberally sprinkling his films with the kind of dark confetti that like-minded people would recognise and appreciate, but this was the most he'd ever leaned into making a horror genre film. Since then, I've probably rewatched Sleepy Hollow about 2 or 3 times and always remembered it as, to my mind, being Tim Burton's last great movie. So I thought it was time to give it a spin again and talk about it here on the channel. And boy, how things have changed. The film is a very loose retelling of Washington Irving's short story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Ichabod Crane, he's no longer a school teacher now. He's a police detective from New York, keen to apply his scientific method to crime detection. He's also not a big-eared, big-nosed lunk. He's Johnny Depp now, and his colleagues in New York are sick to the back teeth of his methods. He's sent to the back of beyond to investigate a series of murders which have supernatural overtones, a real test of his scientific methods. The first thing I noticed upon this most recent watch is cast-wise, there's a real sense of Tim Burton. Hey, let's get the band back together. Clearly Johnny Depp, check. Jeffrey Jones from Beetlejuice, check. Michael Gough from the Batman films, check. Martin Landau from Ed Wood, check. Burton had the chance to work with Vincent Price on Edward Scissorhands, so he uses the same Hollywood Willy Wonka golden ticket to bring Christopher Lee on board to cameo this time out. And truth be told, I don't blame him for that at all. In his shoes, I'd do exactly the same thing, and then I'd invest all my money in building a time machine and I'd travel back in time so I could work with Peter Cushing as well. There's a sense throughout the movie that this is intended to be a kind of love letter to British horror cinema of the 50s and 60s and perhaps even the cinema of Mario Bava. But there's also a sense that Burton is leaning back on this heritage and wallowing in it rather than using it to create something of his own. To that end, the rest of the cast is filled out by practically wall-to-wall lovies, familiar faces of Michael Gambon, Miranda Richardson, Richard Griffiths, Ian McDermott. Take into account that Ray Park, who was physically at least Darth Maul, is one of the stuntmen who plays the Headless Horseman in this, and Sleepy Hollow becomes some weird nexus of Star Wars and Harry Potter, 6 degrees of separation. Left to flounder in this sea of thespianism is the great Christina Ricci in an extremely undercooked role as the love interest. Casper Van Diem in an extremely undercooked career, and Christopher Walken in some fantastic flashbacks as the Hessian before he became the Headless Horseman, who cannot be outshined no matter how many members of the Royal Shakespeare Company are sharing the screen with him. And there's so much to like about this movie. It looks great, it feels great, it's made by one of us, for one of us. There are a ton of deaths in it. There's a headless frickin' horseman who kills people with swords, axes, rides them down with his demonic steed. There's black magic, sorcery, blackmail, double-cross, intrigue. So why has my position in relation to Sleepy Hollow changed quite so much in these 20 years? The answer may be in the origins of the film itself, of which I was unaware before I started doing some preparation for this video. You see, before this film was a Tim Burton movie, it was conceived as a Kevin Yeager film. Kevin Yeager, the makeup effects designer who gave us the scariest looking Freddy Krueger in Nightmare 2, Freddy's Revenge. Kevin Yeager, the director who took his name off the extremely promising Hellraiser Bloodlines following extensive studio interference. Kevin Yeager, who along with Seven script writer Andrew Kevin Walker had the notion to adapt Washington Irving's short story into an effects-heavy gothic slasher movie. That project failed to get enough juice to get into production, but morphed into a Burton project using Yeager and Walker's script as a base, with them getting co-producer credits. And I think this is the root of the film's problems. This isn't a story that Burton had nurtured in his heart, but a story that he Burtonified. Now don't get me wrong, he Burtonified Batman and he super Burtonified Batman Returns. But working on what to a greater or lesser degree is a horror movie and slapping a bit of Burton's sheen on it feels a little like a betrayal of the weirdos and outsiders he spoke up for and represented up until this point. This is not the Beetlejuice Burton, my friends. Make no mistake, Sleepy Hollow is the face of Disney Burton to come. Right at the front of the movie, in the character's own words, Depp plays Crane at the dawn of a new millennium, which will raise an eyebrow straight away, as the film has already told us, not too much previously, that it's set in 1799. The script has confused the rollover from 1799 to 1800 with the transition between the thousands and the 2000s. It's not a great sign if the film requires you to do some quick mental arithmetic in the first few minutes to make sure that you're not going mad. It's a kind of slapdash, that'll do approach that ultimately undermines what could have been another Burton masterpiece. I feel his heart isn't completely in it, and one might imagine that neither was Yeager's or Walker's after the project slipped through their fingers and the rewrites started to bite, and you couldn't see the wood from the trees. What exactly is Sleepy Hollow about? Is it a man of science who comes to a superstitious backwoods and applies his methods to solve an impossible case? No, it turns out not to be. Is it the tale of conspiracy and murder revolving around a will in the great tradition of Jolly? In part, but that's just as a setup and a sort of perfunctory Hercule Poirot, and this is the reason all of this is happening moment. Is it a dreamy fable set in Burtonland, an homage to Bava and Hammer Studios? It's more that than anything else. And in and of that itself, that's fine, but it's clearly such a hodgepodge of Yeager's original concept stitched together with rewrite elements and the whims of Burton's aesthetic that it seems to be a pieced together Frankenstein beast which wants to be all of these things and ends up as none of them. The other reason I found that I'd soured on Sleepy Hollow, and this may not necessarily be fair to the film, is that I saw the ghosts of Christmas future being sown here, a sign of things to come, the setting in of creative rot. In 1999, Depp's Ichabod Crane was a nice quirky turn in a nice gothic Tim Burton movie. Now it's one of a plethora of oddball performances and strange hats and weird accents that elicits a sigh and an eye roll rather than enthusiasm. And for Burton, it's become the thin end of the adaptation wedge. Projects where one feels his heart is more in the pre-production design stage than the story or the finished product. After this comes Planet of the Apes, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Sweeney Todd, Alice in Wonderland, Dark Shadows. Fucking Dark Shadows, man. For all that Sleepy Hollow is absolutely gorgeous to look at, the story is a hot mess. It does exist in that liminal space between the real and unreal that I am ridiculously at home in. Spaces and places like this are my happy place, just like Halloween, truthfully, is my Christmas. I can relax and feel at home among the rubber bats and spooky decorations and black clothes of this type of film, and my mind achieves a certain calm when dipping into a world like this. At this point, I feel like Sleepy Hollow is a wonderful film to have on in the background, and if that's not damning with faint praise, I don't know what is. And I can't quite believe I'm saying this about a beautiful, darkly gothic Tim Burton movie that involves a supernatural killer and contains 18 beheadings. 18 beheadings! And yet I watched Sleepy Hollow with a horrible, dawning realization that it's just not very good. The detective story elements don't gel with the fairy tale or the supernatural aspects. It is stuffed with feebly drawn characters and a meandering narrative. I didn't buy the romance angle between Depp and Ricci one little bit. Ricci is given absolutely nothing to do. And did we really need all those flashbacks to young Ichabod with his wonderful mother and overbearing, horrible, scary father, a device that Burton would employ again at the chocolate factory? I mean, Willy Wonka flashbacks. And can I just say that I'm pretty much at this point over Danny Elfman. Not everything has to sound like a fucking live action cartoon. With Sleepy Hollow, Tim Burton has managed to create a feature-length piece of Halloween decoration. It's packed with beautifully realised seasonal images. The lonely mansion perched atop an empty fog-drenched field, the vicious-looking scarecrows, the twisty and gnarled trees. But somewhere after pre-production, the film lost its soul. And it's only after about a gazillion Pirates of the Caribbean movies and the absolute eye-gouging atrocity of Burton and Depp gleefully trashing Roald Dahl and Lewis Carroll in a succession of wonky hats and funny voices, which made me want to gouge my own eyes out at the boneheaded wrongness of it all, that I can finally see the gnarled wood from the twisted trees. Sleepy Hollow is not an act of creativity, it's product. It's a happy meal.